Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Have you ever wondered why incredibly smart, experienced professionals will sometimes just flat out reject a new idea, even when it's empirically proven to work? It's a really fascinating paradox. Today, we're diving into the hidden structural and psychological forces that make us naturally resist data-driven innovation. We're going to see how our own minds and the systems we work in actually kind of conspire against progress, and more importantly, how we can beat them.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at why we resist good ideas, then jump into the famous Moneyball baseball example. From there, we'll unpack how cognitive biases hinder us, explore some institutional and strategic traps, and finally, look at how to win under high uncertainty.
Section 1. Why we resist good ideas. The illusion of rational progress.
You know, it's incredibly tempting to think of innovation as this perfectly rational, linear process. We love to believe that a better idea just naturally and smoothly replaces a weaker one. But honestly, the research shows that's simply not true. At any given moment, there are multiple competing frameworks trying to explain reality. And new ideas actually live in this really messy, uncertain space right between personal belief and scientific validation. When things are highly uncertain, decision-makers almost always default to the status quo. Why? Because they want to preserve what feels fair or familiar, rather than trusting a new, analytically predicted outcome that just feels weird to them. It's exactly this deep-seated desire to stick to the familiar that sets the stage for massive industry disruptions. Resistance isn't the exception here, it's literally the rule.
Section 2. The Moneyball baseball example. A classic David versus Goliath story.
To really get our heads around this resistance, let's look at a fantastic real-world example, professional baseball in the early 2000s, specifically the Oakland Athletics. Facing massive financial constraints, the A's couldn't afford the same superstar players as the richer teams. They were forced to completely rethink how they evaluated talent. Now, on one side, you had the traditional system, subjective scouting. This relied heavily on visual assessment, like does a player's swing look good, their prior reputation, and basically gut feelings. But on the other side, you have the innovation, rigorous quantitative statistical evaluation. This was driven purely by data, standardized criteria, and cold, hard empirical logic. It was a massive clash of cultures, decades of subjective intuition going head-to-head against raw numbers.
And guess what? The data completely backed up the innovation. Empirical evidence proved that specific metrics, like a player's on-base percentage, strongly correlated with actual success on the field. This allowed a financially strapped team to find incredibly undervalued players and stretch their limited budget. But here's the crazy part. Despite the undeniable analytical strength and clear evidence, this data-driven approach faced absolute outrage from the baseball establishment. Why? Well, because it challenged the core logic of how the game had always been run. It essentially proved that traditional scouts were overvaluing the wrong things, which made their decades of hard-earned subjective experience feel totally obsolete. It was a direct threat.
Section 3. How cognitive biases hinder us. The mind under pressure.
Now, it's crucial to understand that this massive pushback wasn't just old-fashioned stubbornness. The resistance is actually hardwired into how our human cognition operates under uncertainty. When identifying talent, you're making major predictions based on really incomplete information. To deal with that pressure, our brains rely on heuristics, basically mental shortcuts. They're great at simplifying complex problems so we don't just freeze up from overthinking. But the big downside? They introduce systematic biases and errors. A scout might look at a guy and think, well, he looks athletic, he's got the classic baseball build, so he must be good, completely ignoring what the raw performance data says. And because we lean so heavily on these mental shortcuts, our openness to a totally new, data-backed approach drops off a cliff.
These mental shortcuts breed some really powerful cognitive barriers. Let's look at loss aversion, for example. Humans suffer from what's called affective forecasting errors, which is just a fancy way of saying we vastly overestimate how bad losing will feel compared to how good winning will feel. For a baseball executive, the emotional risk of failing with some weird, unfamiliar data model feels agonizing compared to just failing the traditional way. That feeds straight into status quo bias, where professionals will fiercely protect the old way of doing things even when the alternative is clearly better. Toss in confirmation bias, where leaders cherry-pick data to support their old-school gut feelings, and it totally makes sense why entire organizations misidentify talent. The old way just feels safer.
We're also all constrained by something called bounded rationality. Basically, we aren't supercomputers. We can't process every single piece of available data. So, when a decision maker rejects a highly complex, data-driven model like Moneyball, they usually aren't doing it because they found a flaw in the math. They reject it because it just blows past the cognitive frameworks they're used to. It's too much weird, unfamiliar info, so they naturally retreat to the simplified, experience-based strategies they already know.
Let's move to Section 4, Institutional and Strategic Traps. The system fights back.
Okay, so cognitive limits are just one piece of the puzzle. The domain of uncertainty framework actually maps this resistance across 3 interconnected levels. We just talked about the behavioral level in the middle, our cognitive limits. But check out the institutional level right above it. Organizations are not neutral. They're deeply entrenched in established norms and power structures. A radical data-driven method threatens professional identity and the legitimacy of the old guard. And then at the bottom, we have the strategic level. This is all about game theory and the very real career risks of sticking your neck out to try something new.
I want you to think about your own workplace for a second. Ask yourself this purely strategic question. Why on earth would you adopt an unproven innovation early if it exposes you to massive personal and professional risk? If you stick to the traditional way and you fail, well, everyone else is feeling the same way, so you're insulated, you're safe. But if you champion a radical new data model and nobody else follows and you fail, you take 100% of the blame. This strategic environment creates a very rational collective inertia where resisting innovation is literally the smartest career move.
But here's where it gets absolutely brilliant. Embracing a data-driven method like the Moneyball approach actually gives decision-makers a strategic shield. By leaning on quantitative models, you can externalize part of the decision. You shift the burden of justification off of your own personal, subjective gut feeling and onto a systematic analysis. If the outcome goes south, the model absorbs some of the hit, which massively reduces your personal exposure to blame. So data doesn't just make the analysis better, it structurally supports decision-making by making it strategically safer for you to act when things are uncertain.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, Winning Under High Uncertainty. Beyond the baseball diamond.
This whole dynamic of fighting biases to find hidden value, it applies anywhere resources are tight and uncertainty is high. It perfectly mirrors the financial markets. Take this quote referencing Benjamin Graham, the legendary father of value investing. His whole philosophy was built on finding assets whose intrinsic value is ignored by the market. And why does the market miss that value? Because of the exact same cognitive biases, heuristics, and status quo bias that cause baseball scouts to misjudge players. The logic behind finding these inefficiencies is completely universal.
So what's our big takeaway here? We really need to reframe how we view pushback. Resistance shouldn't just be seen as this annoying barrier to progress. Instead, think of it as a collective defense mechanism. It's a rigorous testing ground. It forces an idea to prove it can survive deep uncertainty before it's applied. An idea doesn't win just because the math is right, it wins because it's strong enough to survive the absolute gauntlet of human nature and institutional politics.
Which leaves us with this final critical question. Winning requires correct analysis, sure, but do you have the courage to act on it? Because whether you're managing a baseball roster, an investment portfolio, or a team at your company, knowing the right approach is only half the battle. Having the data isn't enough. You have to be willing to act under uncertainty, break the established norms, and accept the outcomes. The data can point you in the right direction, but at the end of the day, you still have to take the step. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this totally changes the way you look at innovation and the hidden forces holding it back.